Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to remove flare from your landscape photographs. There are actually a few things you can do out in the field to either prevent flare from happening in the first place or to make it easier to handle once you're back on the computer. But I'm going to cover those methods once I'm actually back out in the field myself, which hopefully will be in a month or so when I go hiking in Scotland, which is pretty exciting, having been stuck at home for so long now. So in this video, I am going to show you how to remove flare that's already there in your images when you don't have flare-free photos to refer back to. So I'm going to show you three different methods. The simplest is cloning, which you might be familiar with already, but I'll give you a couple of cloning tips just to make sure you can do a really clean job if you need to take that approach. Then I'm going to cover two more advanced approaches. The first is the frequency separation approach, which is favored by many professional photographers. And then I'm going to show you the curves flare removal method, which is the method that I use most often, although I do also use that frequency separation method. They have their pros and cons, which I will discuss. But they are more advanced techniques, so please do make sure you either understand curves or otherwise watch my curves videos before watching this one so that you can really follow along with what I'm teaching you. So let's get started. For reference, this is the edited version of the image we're going to work on, and I have already done some flare reduction here, although in this particular case it was fairly straightforward. So if I turn on this flare reduction group here, then you can see all this red blotchiness appear, and some of these flares are fairly obvious, like this red area in the shadow of the trees here, whereas some of it is a little bit harder to spot, like the red that's coming into the shadows underneath the leaves of this tree, which incidentally is called a cabbage tree. And there's this arc of red as well that may also be harder to spot. Now, the harder to spot flares, of course, probably matter less because the viewer might not notice them, but I still like to remove them when I see them, and it maybe takes a little bit more practice to be able to spot those. But this was not particularly hard, as I mentioned, and you can see those all magically disappear and it looks nice and clean now, and I'll talk about that at the end of the video. But I chose this exposure set because it's actually a exposure bracketed panorama. So there's 6 frames used to create this file, 2 horizontal frames, each a 3-shot exposure bracket, and the leftmost frame had a really prominent flare where this tree is here, but the rightmost frame didn't, and because this was in the overlap region, the stitching software, which in this case was Lightroom, did a good job of choosing the flare free image for that particular zone of the image, so it wasn't such a problem when I came to edit this, but I did remember that it was there. And so this is the brightest exposure of one of those exposure sets, and you can see this very prominent flare and a little green flare there, and this slightly ugly flare to the right as well. So it's this area that we're going to work on for the purposes of this video. First up, I'm going to quickly take you through cloning for flare removal, which is one of the methods that you could kind of replicate in Lightroom. So obviously I am using Photoshop here, and if you are only editing in Lightroom, you might just have to accept that these rare occasions where you have really problematic flares will be very difficult to fix in Lightroom. Photoshop does have that bit more control, but do remember that this is a relatively rare occurrence that you have problematic flares like this. And they're problematic because there isn't a nice clean background for the software programs to do sort of automatic fixing. So the spot correction tool in Lightroom, for example, can work pretty well with lots of different kinds of flares as long as they're on a fairly clean background. But this obviously isn't that, and so it's much harder, and we really need to use Photoshop. So I'm going to start by trying the sort of content-aware spot correction that Photoshop has. So that's this tool here, and we're going to make sure that it's got content-aware selected there and sample all layers. I very rarely change off that, to be perfectly honest. And we're going to create a new layer here, which we're going to call clone, although I very rarely bother to label my layers, to be perfectly honest. And we're just going to try and get rid of this small flare here, because this large one is just going to be way too hard, quite frankly, to do a good job with the clone tool. So we're going to tackle this little green flare first, and we're just going to paint over the entire thing fairly roughly and just see how well Photoshop handles it. And the answer is it does a pretty good job, especially tonally. We've got rid of all of that unwanted color, and it fits in quite nicely, almost to the point that nobody would ever notice that we'd cloned there unless they really started to look, and then they'd see that the foliage starts to cut into the trunk and the trunk is no longer continuous. So it hasn't done a perfect job texturally from a detail perspective. So you can always undo that and then just give it another go and see if it does a better job. And maybe this time it has, but still not perfect. So let's try again. I didn't paint that quite so accurately. And you can see it's also repeating this little leaf here, which is a bit of a problem because we know that that's repeated. So it's never going to do a perfect job. And what you could do is actually just use the clone tool to correct the mistakes that it's made. That's what I probably would do. But because I want to show you how to clone, I'm going to purely do this with the clone tool. There are a couple of things that you need to remember when you're cloning. The first is that ideally you want to use a fairly hard brush. So you've got your brush settings up here. You can see the size and hardness of brush that I'm using. And you also want to use it at 100% opacity as much as possible. And the reason for doing that, both the hardness and the 100% opacity, is because you don't want to blur details. And if there's a soft edged brush, it's going to blur things together and you end up with mushy details. So you can do that at the end, but really you want to try and use a hard brush if you can. The second thing to remember is that you're trying to match patterns, and so you need to kind of break the flare up into different zones. For example, we'll treat this trunk separately to how we treat the foliage and so on. So if you alt click somewhere on the tree, then you can sample an area that looks like it might fit in. I actually don't want to select this area next to this bright bit of foliage because you can see we're trying to find trunk running into dark foliage. So let's select here, and we're going to just paint in this area here first because that's where the flare really starts. We're not going to worry about that leaf too much. We're going to handle that at the end. And we'll just carry on painting up and see what it looks like. And you can see at this point we're still actually aligning with where the trunk was pretty effectively. So that's actually done a really nice job. But as we go a bit higher, it starts to just slightly drift off. So at this point we're going to select from up here and just complete that section. And you might need to come in and fix certain spots locally. Like you can see there's a bit of flare there and a bit of flare there. So getting quick at doing the alt clicking is certainly helpful. So that's the continuity of the trunk. The trunk is pretty much fixed now. And we can just get rid of those two repeated patterns to make sure if anybody sees this as a gigantic print, they don't suddenly go, oh, hang on a second, that's repeated from down there, which would be a real shame. So next up, we're going to tackle the foliage area. And of course, it's exactly the same process. Alt clicking, trying to do it with a hard brush where you can, trying to avoid repeated textures. So remembering that we've actually repeated this texture now. So we can go back and fix that by just breaking it up a little bit so that it doesn't look exactly the same as somewhere else. So we get away with it there. And then we can come in and do this kind of thing. Now we're going to come up against a problem here because we're going to run bright leaves into darker leaves, and this is where I might start to try and blend the two together. So if I set the opacity to 50% here, then I'm just going to try and see if I can break up that junction there. And now we have a pretty much perfect clone job, I would say. I think that's really looking quite natural. So there's before and there's after. So the clone tool can work really well for those really bright, small flares. Next up is the frequency separation method, which so many professionals use. It's a really good way of removing flare. It's not perfect, but it's a great tool to have in your arsenal. Unfortunately, it does require either you learning a process or recording an action. There are lots of videos showing you how to record actions, so you can follow those separately. I'm just going to talk you through the process from scratch. So the idea behind it is that you separate the detail information and the color information. And the first step is duplicating the background layer. So you select it and then press Ctrl J twice, would duplicate it twice. And then we're going to call one of these layers color with the U because I'm English, and the one above it we're going to call detail. And we're going to hide that detail layer initially, and the color layer we're going to blur. So we're going to select filter, blur, Gaussian blur. You can use any blur you want, but Gaussian blur is the quickest. And you want the radius to usually be around 10 pixels in my experience. The goal here is to blur the detail out completely, but keep the color information roughly where it should be. Obviously, it will blur outside of the bounds of the detail, but that's actually kind of dealt with in the process. So we click OK here, and then we're going to select the detail layer and turn the visibility on there. And this is the tricky bit. You have to select image and then apply image. And then you essentially need to repeat all of these settings that I have here. So you want to make sure that the color layer is selected, that the channel is RGB. If you're working in 16-bit, which you definitely should be if you're using this kind of advanced process, then you want to select invert here and set the blending to add. And then you need the scale to be set to 2. And then you click OK. Now, just before we do the last step here, I just want you to notice that there is detail information in this layer, but there is also color information. And that color information does correct the color that is bled outside the bounds of the detail, if that makes any sense. Some of this stuff is quite honestly a complete nightmare to explain to someone who can't respond to me like you, the YouTube viewer, but hopefully you kind of get what I'm talking about there. So the last step is to change the blend mode here to linear light. And you should notice if I turn both of these off that the result of combining those two layers is they are absolutely identical to that background layer. But the difference is we have separated the color and detail information. So I'm going to put these two into a layer group. So just select both of them and select the folder icon there. And we're going to call this frequency separation. I've probably misspelt that now, but anyway. Okay, so that's our layer group. So we turn it off and on and you see that there is no change at all. But what we can do now is actually change the color without changing the detail. So I'm going to show you how we can get rid of this flare here, but in contrast to the clone method that I just showed you, we're actually going to maintain the original detail that exists behind the flare here as much as possible. So I'm going to select the color layer, and if I alt click on it, you can see this is the blurred color layer that we have. And what we're trying to do is just paint in the approximate areas of color into the right place. So we're going to use the clone tool to do that, just as we did before. And I'm going to select this flare free area and just start painting it in up here. And this time we are going to use a soft brush, actually a soft large brush. So let's paint that at 100% opacity, and you can see now that I'm correcting the color. So I'm removing the color of the flare, but the texture is being maintained. So that's the real beauty of this method here. But you do need to be careful that you actually do get rid of that color, of course. And you see it's not absolutely perfect, and maybe you need some local adjustments to fix that. But it's doing a very, very good job indeed. And we can do a similar thing here. So it's kind of the same idea in that you do need to get the color about right. You need to select from the right areas to do a decent job. But you can see that that has done a pretty good job even on quite a difficult flare. And we can follow this same process in other areas in the image. So we can try and use it to get rid of this much larger flare. But there are points at which we're going to start to see it failing. And that's because we're not actually removing the color directly, and we're trying to match what we think the color should be underneath, but of course we can't do that perfectly. For example, there's some difference between the top edge of this branch here and the shadowed area. So we actually would need to match perfectly this to wherever that equivalent texture lies on the background here. And what you kind of end up with is what looks a little bit crunchy and over digitized when you're working in these really complex detailed areas. That said, this does work really beautifully when you've got simple backgrounds. You can do an absolutely flawless job and maintain the texture as long as the texture and color is a bit more consistent than what we have here. So that's kind of the limit of this method. It's not absolutely flawless. And for example, if we try to get rid of the flare in front of this frond here, then we have to try and really, I mean, you can see the color is probably changing a little bit, and yeah, we kind of get away with it, but it's just not perfect. So it's a little bit time consuming and complex, but it works absolutely brilliantly on the right kind of flares, but this isn't the right kind of flare. And that brings us to our last method, which is the curves correction, flare correction method. The frequency separation method has done a great job with that little green flare, and actually this curves method doesn't handle that kind of flare very well because it's very intensely colourful and there's a big loss of contrast there. So we're going to leave that adjustment in as it was, and now look at the curves method for these orange flares. In order to understand how this method works, you first want to think about what a flare actually is. And in this case, it's actually just a bit of colored light over the top of the image. So it's caused by an internal reflection, and it has, in this case, a fairly pure color, albeit you can see it's sort of brighter around the edges here than it is in the center. And so it's actually that color of light that we need to remove. And the curves tool is a really good way of doing that. And if you watched the third part of my curves video where I removed haze from the image using the curves tool, then this is actually exactly the same principle. So let's create a new curves adjustment layer. And the first thing I'm going to do is go into the color channels here, and I'm going to select the red color channel. Now, if I take red out of the image, then it would be equivalent to removing a red flare, but we don't have a red flare here. We actually have an orange flare. And orange is the combination of red and a little bit of green. So you do need to know your color theory potentially to recognize that kind of thing. But actually, since most flares are some shade of red or yellow, you can actually figure it out as just a combination of red and green in most cases. So we're going to set a new black point in the red channel that will have the effect of effectively taking away that red light that the flare adds. And I'm just going to go way overboard with this initially. And then with the green channel, well, I know that this is more red than it is yellow, so I'm not going to go as far with that green adjustment. I'm just going to take a small amount out. And then I think we'll just, well, maybe let's go a little bit further than that. And then let's take a bit more red out still. So you don't actually need to worry too much about exactly where you're stopping with this, because we're going to gradually paint this adjustment in. So that's our adjustment, but obviously we don't want that applied to the entire image. So we select our layer mask and fill it with black, or Control I will invert it. And now we're back to our original image. And what I'm going to do is paint in that adjustment, but I'm going to do it very gradually. I'm going to do it at a 10% opacity. So the 1 key is the shortcut to do that. And then I'm going to use a fairly soft brush, but that kind of matches the softness of the edge of the flare there. That's going to make it a little bit easier. In fact, let's start a little bit larger to start off. So I'm now just going to paint white in over the layer mask here, and we will gradually paint away that flare. So you'll barely see each click making a difference, but they are gradually building that change. So you can hopefully see that that flare is just starting to disappear. Now this does take a bit of refining to get an absolutely perfect result. The good news is you can create as many of these layers as you want and stack them one on top of another. So as long as you're moving in the right direction with each one of these corrections, in fact, let's just turn the opacity up so we can do this a little bit faster. As long as you're moving in the right direction, you can actually just stack them one on top of another on top of another. So you can see that that flare really is starting to disappear quite effectively. And occasionally it doesn't do a perfect job, and I will combine this method with a cloning method or the frequency separation method to get a really perfect result. But most of the time, even with relatively complex, difficult flares like this one here, it will actually do a really good job. So that's after the edit and that's before. So you can see we've made a really dramatic change here. We've not completely eliminated the flare, and you can see just here we've gone a bit too far. So I'm going to paint black in that area just to bring back a bit of that flare, because we don't want to create a new problem obviously in removing the flare. And we can do exactly the same with this flare on the right hand side. So let's paint that in white with a fairly large brush originally, and obviously we have to paint more in where the flare is more intense, and you can see that flare starting to magically disappear. Let's see. So this is really starting to look quite good, particularly in this area, because of course this flare here is a little bit less intense, so it is easier to remove, and it looks really like we've almost completely removed that flare in particular at our first pass. I'm just painting it back in there a little bit because I went a bit too far. So there's our before and there's our after. I mean, there's absolutely no way anybody's going to notice that the flare was here, that's for sure. Now this one is still a bit too obvious, so I'm just going to create a new curves adjustment, and we're going to do exactly the same thing. I mean, I guess you could actually just duplicate the same layer and use that adjustment, but take away a bit of red and a bit of green, and again invert that mask. So selecting it, Control I so that it's black, and then again painting in white into this area very gradually. Let's do it 30% at a time again. And I suppose I should do some of this offline so that you haven't got to watch me do a million clicks here, because there is an element of being able to spot the color and recognize what needs doing. So this isn't a completely beginner process, because if you can't see the color, then you can't see the change that you need to make. So I am going to pause this here, and I'm going to follow exactly the same thought process just to perfectly clean up this flare. So that's after I've spent a little bit more time just trying to get that mask as accurate as I possibly could. But I did notice as I was trying to remove that orange color, everything's starting to shift a little bit green. And that's because I wasn't sufficiently accurate when I was guessing the actual color of the flare. So I didn't take enough green away. So I've selected my first adjustment here again, and I select that green channel. And if I pull the green a little bit further to the right, you start to see perfect color matching starting to happen. So painting the mask very accurately is very important, but you don't necessarily need to get the color match absolutely perfect when you first start, because you can always correct that afterwards. And really the result you can achieve here is far better than through any other method that I'm aware of. So if we turn, actually let's put these two layers into a group so that we can see them working together. So there's the after and the before. So that's a really prominent flare. It doesn't look like you can sensibly remove that, but with accurate use of curves and masks, you can completely eliminate it from your images. So it does take a little bit of time. You can probably look at the timestamp actually, because my clock there, my computer clock should tell you how long it took me to do that. And obviously I do have an eye for it, and that doesn't come immediately. But if you can learn how to apply this technique, it's incredibly powerful. It gives you a lot of control, and you can really do beautiful jobs when it comes to flare removal. So hopefully you have enjoyed that video, and if you'd like to see more content like this in future, please do subscribe and comment away. If you have any questions, then please do ask, because they're always useful for coming up for video ideas in the future.